A man became a source of both amazement and suspicion when people began seeing him ride his bicycle calmly through town each morning, followed by a full-grown wild bobcat, no leash in sight, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. The two moved together with uncanny discipline. The bobcat stayed close, matching his pace, ignoring passing cars, barking dogs, and curious onlookers, showing a level of focus and trust that left even wildlife-savvy locals baffled. As the unusual sight became part of the daily routine, whispers spread through the neighborhood. When police finally arrived at his remote cabin alongside wildlife officers, they uncovered an unbelievable secret that would change the town forever. So what was the truth behind this impossible bond? Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning sun over the town of Silver Creek, Montana, always seemed to break with a deliberate, crystalline clarity. It was a high-altitude light, sharp and revealing, washing over the ponderosa pines and the clapboard storefronts with a brightness that made colors sing. In this quiet corner of the American West, routines were as durable as the granite peaks that framed the horizon. The diner opened at 6, the mail truck arrived at 8, and at exactly 7:15, Thomas Adler rode his bicycle down Main Street. To the casual observer, Thomas was an unremarkable figure. He was a man in his late 60s, with the weathered, parchment-like skin of someone who had spent a lifetime working outdoors. He wore faded flannel shirts, practical cargo shorts, and a baseball cap that had long since lost its logo to the sun. His bicycle was an older mountain model, sturdy and well-maintained, with tires that hummed against the asphalt. But it was not Thomas who caused the cars to slow down, or the early morning joggers to stop in their tracks, mouths agape. It was what, or rather, who, followed him. Loping behind the bicycle, moving with a fluid, liquid grace that seemed to defy the friction of the pavement, was a fully grown North American bobcat. This was not a small creature. It was a magnificent specimen, likely weighing 30 pounds, with a coat of tawny brown fur dappled with black rosettes that shimmered in the morning light. Its ears were tipped with the distinctive black tufts that gave the species its wild, alert appearance, and its ruff of cheek fur framed a face that held golden, piercing eyes. The bobcat did not run with the frantic energy of a dog chasing a car. It moved with a silent, tactical precision. When Thomas pedaled, the cat matched his speed, its large padded paws hitting the ground in a rhythmic trot. When Thomas coasted around a curve, the cat leaned into the turn, cutting the angle perfectly. Occasionally, if Thomas slowed near the uphill grade of Sycamore Avenue, the bobcat would accelerate, placing its front paws momentarily on Thomas's lower back or the rear rack of the bike, as if urging him forward before dropping back to all fours. They moved in a bubble of silence. There were no leashes, no collars, no shock commands. Thomas never looked back, and the bobcat never looked away from Thomas. For the first few weeks, the residents of Silver Creek were too stunned to speak. The sight was so surreal, so utterly at odds with the laws of nature, that people assumed it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a very strange, exotic breed of dog. But as the summer deepened and the pair became a daily fixture, the shock wore off, replaced by a growing, uneasy murmur that rippled through the community. "It's not right," Mrs. Higgins whispered one Tuesday morning at the grandiose communal table of the Bluebird Diner. She gestured with a piece of toast towards the window as Thomas and the beast glided past. "That's a wild animal, not a golden retriever. You can't just ride a bike with a predator in tow. He's got it hypnotized or something." "I heard he traps them," muttered fierce old Mr. Henderson, a retired mechanic who viewed anything unusual with deep suspicion. I heard he drugs them, keeps them sedated so they think he's their mother. It's cruel is what it is. That animal should be in the woods, hunting rabbits, not trotting on pavement like a show pony." The whispers grew darker as the days shortened. People began to analyze Thomas's demeanor. Why didn't he smile? Why did he never stop to explain himself? He was a recluse, living in the old cabin at the edge of the chaotic tree line where the town ended and the wilderness began. He bought his groceries in silence and paid in cash. To the townspeople, the discipline of the Bobcat was proof of dominance. How else could a man command a creature known for its solitary, elusive nature? In the wild, Lynx Rufus was a ghost. You didn't see them unless they wanted you to. Yet here was one, parading down Main Street in broad daylight, ignoring the barking of chained dogs and the honking of delivery trucks. The consensus shifted from amazement to moral outrage. The narrative became one of exploitation. Thomas Adler was no longer just an eccentric. In the eyes of Silver Creek, he was a villain who had broken the spirit of a wild thing for his own amusement. Unaware, or perhaps simply uncaring of the storm gathering in the valley below, Thomas Adler continued his routine. What the townspeople couldn't see from their windows was the reality of the life he lived inside the cabin at the edge of the woods. The interior of Thomas's home was not a dungeon of cages and whips. It was a warm, cluttered sanctuary of books, hand-carved wood, and silence. And it was a place of deep, pervading sorrow. Thomas had been a widower for 3 years. His wife, Martha, had been the voice of the house, the one who filled the rooms with music and laughter. When she passed, the silence she left behind was so heavy it felt physical, like a thick wool blanket that dampened the air. Thomas had retreated into himself, his world shrinking to the perimeter of his property. The Bobcat, whom he had named Russet for the reddish hue of his summer coat, was not a prisoner. In fact, the back door of Thomas's cabin had a specially installed heavy-duty pet flap, large enough for a medium-sized dog or a bobcat. It was never locked. Russet was free. He spent his nights prowling the dense underbrush of the forest, hunting mice and voles, engaging in the ancient, solitary rhythms of his species. But every morning, without fail, as the sky began to lighten from indigo to violet, Russet would return. He would slip through the flap, jump onto the foot of Thomas's bed, and knead the heavy quilt until Thomas stirred. The bike rides hadn't started as a trick. They had started as therapy, for both of them. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching Russet groom himself on the rug near the wood stove. The bond between them was the unbelievable secret the town couldn't fathom. But for Thomas, it was a heavy burden. He looked at the animal, his heart aching. "You should go, you know," Thomas murmured softly. The sound of his voice caused Russet's ears to swivel like radar dishes, though the cat didn't stop grooming. "People are talking, Russet. They think I'm hurting you." Russet paused, looking up with those intense amber eyes. He let out a short, chirping sound, not a meow, but the distinctive bird-like trill bobcats make. He stood up, stretched his spine in a long arch, and walked over to Thomas, rubbing his cheek against the denim of Thomas's jeans. The purr that emanated from the cat was deep and guttural, vibrating through Thomas's leg. The truth was, Thomas was a rehabber, though a retired one. Years ago, before Martha died, they had specialized in raptors, owls, and hawks. But they knew the laws of the wild. Keep them wild, release them fast. Russet was a failure of that protocol, but an accidental one. He had been found 3 years ago, a starving, dehydration-racked kitten the size of a soda can, mewling beside the twisted wreckage of a fallen oak tree during a massive storm. The mother was nowhere to be found. Thomas had taken him in, intending to transfer him to a big cat center in the city. But then Martha had fallen ill. In the chaos of hospitals, treatments, and the slow, agonizing goodbye, the transfer never happened. The kitten became a fixture of the dying house. Russet had sat by Martha's bedside for hours, his presence a grounding force while Thomas fell apart. When Martha died, Thomas was ready to die too. He had stopped eating. He had stopped going outside. It was Russet who had forced him back to life. The cat would bite his ankles until he got up to fill the food bowl. The cat would howl at the door until Thomas opened it. And one day, when Thomas dusted off his old bicycle just to feel the wind on his face, trying to outrun his grief, he looked back to see the teenage Bobcat sprinting behind him, unwilling to let him go alone. The bike rides became their language. For Thomas, it was the only time he felt the bright and clear feeling of the past. For Russet, it was a patrol, a way to ensure the pack leader, or perhaps the pack responsibility, was safe. But Thomas knew the whispers in town were turning into shouts. He had seen the way the sheriff's deputy looked at him yesterday. He knew time was running out. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, under a sky that had turned a bruised purple with incoming rain. Thomas was in his garage, oiling the chain of his bike, when the gravel of his driveway crunched under the tires of 3 vehicles. He froze, the oil rag in his hand. Through the dusty window, he saw the sheriff's cruiser, an animal control van, and a sleek black SUV with state government plates. His chest tightened. He looked down at Russet, who was sleeping atop a pile of old burlap sacks in the corner. "Wake up, buddy," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. "They're here." Russet woke instantly, his body tensing, sensing the change in Thomas's pheromones. He didn't run. He moved to Thomas's side, letting out a low, warning growl. "Hush," Thomas commanded gently. "No aggression. That will only make it worse." There was a heavy pounding on the garage door. "Thomas Adler, this is Sheriff Miller. We have a warrant to inspect the premises regarding the possession of illegal wildlife. Open up." Thomas took a deep breath. He opened the side door and stepped out, closing it behind him to keep Russet inside. He faced the group. There were 5 of them. The sheriff, 2 animal control officers with catch poles that looked like medieval weapons, and a woman in a beige uniform with the insignia of the State Wildlife Department. "Morning, Sheriff," Thomas said, his voice dry. "Thomas," the sheriff nodded, looking uncomfortable. "We've had complaints, a lot of them. Folks say you're keeping a wild bobcat. You know that's a Class 2 violation without a permit, and even with one, there are strict containment laws. We need to seize the animal." "He's not seized," Thomas said, his hands shaking slightly. "He's not kept. He's free." The woman from the state stepped forward. Her name tag read, Dr. Aris, wildlife biologist. Her face was stern, her eyes scanning the property for cages. "Mr. Adler, bobcats don't just walk with people. If that animal is following you, it's either because it's been food conditioned to the point of dependency, or you've restrained it in a way that breaks its spirit. Either way, it's a danger to the public and itself. We need to tranquilize it and assess it. If it's habituated, it may have to be euthanized." The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Euthanized. "You can't," Thomas choked out. "He's my family." "That's exactly the problem," Dr. Aris said, her voice softening but remaining firm. Wild animals aren't family, Mr. Adler. They are wildlife. By treating him like a human companion, you've likely signed his death warrant. Now please, step aside. The animal control officers moved toward the garage door. "Wait!" Thomas shouted. "Just watch. Please, don't use the poles. You'll scare him and he'll fight. And if he fights, you'll kill him." He looked at Dr. Aris, pleading with his eyes. "Give me 5 minutes, let me show you. If you see fear or aggression or restraint, take him. But just look." Dr. Aris paused, exchanging a look with the sheriff. "5 minutes," she said, "but the tranquilizer gun stays aimed." Thomas turned to the garage door. He didn't open it. He simply whistled, a specific 2-note whistle he used when he filled the water bowl. The side door creaked open. The officers tensed, grips tightening on their poles. Russet stepped out. He didn't slink. He walked with his head high, the tufts of his ears twitching as he analyzed the wind. He saw the strangers. A wild bobcat would have bolted for the trees or hissed and attacked. A purely domesticated pet might have run up to beg for food. Russet did neither. He looked at the strangers with a cool, regal indifference, then turned his body and leaned firmly against Thomas's leg. He sat down, wrapping his tail around his paws, and looked up at Thomas, waiting. It was a display of absolute trust, but it was what happened next that shattered the assumptions of the experts. Thomas walked over to his bike, leaning against the garage wall. He wheeled it out. "Let's go, Russet," he whispered. Thomas mounted the bike and began to pedal slowly down the driveway. The officers watched, stunned. Russet didn't wait for a command. He fell into position at the rear wheel, checking over his shoulder at the strangers to ensure they weren't following, effectively placing himself as a rearguard shield between the threat and Thomas. Dr. Aris lowered her tranquilizer rifle. She was watching closely. She saw the lack of a collar. She saw the muscle tone of the cat, lean, powerful, clear eyes, shiny coat. This was not an abused animal. This was an alpha predator in its prime. "Stop!" Dr. Aris called out. Thomas braked. Russet stopped instantly, sitting again. Dr. Aris walked forward slowly, leaving her weapon behind. She stopped 10 feet away. She crouched down. "Mr. Adler," she said, her voice filled with a professional curiosity that had replaced her hostility. "How do you keep him here? What are the barriers?" "There are none," Thomas said, gesturing to the endless woods behind the cabin. "The back door has a flap. He goes out every night. He hunts. He mates. I've heard him calling in the spring, but he comes back." "Why?" she asked. "Why does he come back?" Thomas looked down at his hands on the handlebars. The drama of the moment stripped away his defenses. "Because I'm not keeping him," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "He's keeping me." Dr. Aris asked to examine the cat. To everyone's shock, Thomas knelt down, spoke quietly to Russet, and the bobcat allowed the biologist to approach. She didn't touch him. That would be pushing luck. But she got close enough to see the pupils, the respiration, the posture. "He's healthy," she announced to the sheriff. "Incredibly healthy. No signs of malnutrition. No signs of stress behaviors like pacing or over-grooming." She stood up and looked at the crowd. "And he's not imprinted in the traditional sense. He knows we are threats. He's tolerating us only because he," she pointed to Thomas, "is calm." They went inside the cabin. The officers expected a hoarder's den. Instead, They found the clean, sad home of a widower. They saw the pet door. Dr. Aris inspected it. She pushed it open. It led directly into the national forest. He could leave any time, the sheriff noted, scratching his head. Hell, he could have run off just now when he saw the guns. Mr. Adler. Dr. Aris sat at the kitchen table. This shouldn't exist. It's a statistical impossibility. A mature male bobcat is a solitary, territorial animal. For him to bond with a primate, with you, to this extent, it defies our behavioral models. Thomas sat opposite her. He looked tired. I told you, he's keeping me. Thomas rolled up the sleeve of his flannel shirt. On his wrist was a medical alert bracelet. I have a heart condition, Thomas revealed. Arrhythmia, and prone to sudden drops in blood pressure. Since Martha died, it's gotten worse. Stress triggers it. He looked at Russet, who had followed them in and was now lying under the table, his head resting on Thomas's foot. 3 months ago, I collapsed in the garden, Thomas said. I blacked out. I would have died of exposure. It was a freezing night. I woke up because Russet was lying on top of my chest. He was licking my face, crying that loud, screaming cry they do. He kept me warm. And the noise. It alerted the neighbor, Mr. Henderson, who was walking his dog half a mile away. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. The town thinks I ride the bike to show him off. I don't. I ride the bike because it's the only exercise my doctor lets me do. And Russet, he knows. If I get off the bike and stumble, he's there. He leans against me. He props me up. The unbelievable secret wasn't that Thomas was a magical whisperer or a cruel captor. It was that the relationship had inverted. The human had saved the kitten, yes. But now, the apex predator was acting as a service animal. Not through training, not through coercion, but through a profound voluntary empathy that science struggled to quantify. Dr. Aris stared at the man and the cat. As a scientist, she knew she should write a citation. She knew the law was black and white. No wild animals as pets. But she also knew what she was seeing. This wasn't a pet. This was a partnership. If we take him, Dr. Aris said slowly, mostly to herself, we break the bond. The stress would likely kill the cat. He's not fully wild anymore, but he's not domestic. He's something else. He's yours. She looked at the sheriff. Sheriff, technically, the law states you cannot confine a wild animal. Mr. Adler is not confining it. The door is open. The animal is choosing to be here. This falls under a gray area of extreme habituation. The sheriff sighed, hooking his thumbs in his belt. He looked at the old man, looking smaller and frailer than he had on the street. So, no cages? No cages, Thomas said. And he doesn't bite? Only the mice in the barn, Thomas said. The sheriff looked at Dr. Aris. Well, Doc, you're the state expert. Is this a public safety threat? Dr. Aris looked at Russet. The cat blinked slowly, his golden eyes radiating a calm intelligence. As long as the public stays away and doesn't try to pet him, she said. I'd say the cat is more disciplined than half the dogs in this county. The investigation was closed, but the story was just beginning. Dr. Aris wrote a report, but she didn't file it as a violation. She filed it as a behavioral case study. She kept the location vague to protect them from tourists. However, she did speak to the town council. She stood before the very people who had whispered about cruelty and witchcraft at the diner. She explained to Mrs. Higgins and Mr. Henderson what she had seen. She explained that Thomas Adler wasn't a monster. He was a fragile man being guarded by a wild angel. She explained that the discipline they saw on the bike rides was actually the Bobcat's way of monitoring Thomas's vitals, staying close enough to catch him if he fell. The mood in Silver Creek shifted overnight. The suspicion evaporated, replaced by a deep collective shame, and then a protective reverence. The next morning, the sun rose with that same bright, clear intensity, washing the world in gold. Thomas Adler brought his bike out to the road. He felt the familiar weight of anxiety. Would they shout at him? Would they call the police again? He swung his leg over the frame and began to pedal. Russet trotted out from the bushes, shaking the dew from his coat, and took his position at the rear wheel. As they passed the Bluebird Diner, the door opened. Mrs. Higgins stepped out. She didn't glare. She didn't point. She simply raised a hand and waved. "Morning, Thomas," she called out cheerfully. "Morning, Russet." Thomas nearly wobbled the bike in surprise. He raised a hand tentatively in return. Further down the street, the delivery truck driver slowed down, giving them a wide, respectful berth, offering a friendly honk. A group of teenagers, usually loud and raucous, went silent as the pair passed, watching with wide, respectful eyes, witnessing a magic they now understood. The ride that morning felt different. The air was warmer, not just from the sun, but from the absence of judgment. Thomas felt a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't realized he was carrying. They reached the top of the hill, the turnaround point of their route. Thomas stopped the bike and put his foot down. He looked out over the valley. The town of Silver Creek nestled in the green bowl of the mountains, the steam rising from the rooftops. Russet walked up beside him. The great cat rubbed his head against Thomas's calf, purring so loudly it sounded like a small engine. Thomas reached down, burying his hand in the thick, warm fur of the bobcat's neck. "We're okay, buddy," Thomas whispered, a genuine smile breaking across his face for the first time in 3 years. "We're okay." The secret was out, but it wasn't a scandal. It was a testament. It was a reminder to the people of Silver Creek that love comes in many forms, that loyalty can cross the boundaries of species, and that sometimes the things we fear are the very things trying to save us. Thomas turned the bike around. The road home was downhill, easy and smooth. He coasted, the wind drying the tears in his eyes, while behind him, his guardian, his friend, his wild heart ran free and faithful all the way home.